Numbers chapter 12. All right. Let's follow along. I'm just going to read the first few verses, and then we'll be back taking a look at this 12th chapter. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken to us also?" And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek. I love this verse. More than all people who are on the face of the earth. We'll explain what that means. Sounds like he's bragging on himself, but you'll see that he's not. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." And the three of them came out. And then we're going to get a little bit more into this. All right? So if you have your outline, last week when we started this discussion or this series through Numbers, you will see some things today that seem similar to last week, but the situation is different. Last week we talked about a group of individuals, including the Jews, who were complaining and griping not only to Moses, but more so to God because of things going on in their life. It wasn't quite what they thought it was going to be when they left Egypt, and they were just unhappy. Today, Moses is going to teach us some things about handling opposition that sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources. Now, I don't want anybody to raise their hand with this, but I'm wondering if in your lifetime, maybe you've had some tension with a family member, maybe with someone that you were close to at one time but no longer are. And maybe now you're back in closeness to them, but there was a time when they ended up speaking out against you. Maybe you didn't know why, but there was problems and you wondered, what do I do? What do I say? And that's kind of where Moses is at. He's not expecting what we've just read in chapter 12. You see, Miriam and Aaron are his sister and his brother. And I don't think he had this on his radar that this would happen. So this morning I want to talk about how do you handle this stuff. It's not always easy to do, but it's a reality. So grab your outline. So we saw last week, we said when you read in Numbers, you'll read about the mercy of God and how God provides. We read about his grace. But the one thing I do like too about Numbers is you read about the humanness of Moses. He's no different than you and I. He has his battles. He deals with issues like you and I do. And as we said, we have those people in our life that for whatever reason, they've changed their tune towards us. Maybe they were supportive of us at one time. Now they're not. You don't know why. We'll see why for Moses and his situation with Aaron and Miriam. But what I want us to see is this. And you can read some of this as we go. I'm just kind of setting the stage. Verse 1 is a smokescreen. When these two individuals, Miriam and Aaron, spoke against Moses, Moses notices that twice they mention the fact that he had married a Cushite woman. So they went after his wife. Now, I don't know about you, but husbands and wives, them is fighting words. You want to come after me? Fine. Don't go after my family. Pure and simple. And so I'm thinking, here's Moses, and his brother and sister decide that they're going to complain about the woman that he married. Now, it's all just a cover for the real problem. But this is where they begin. And so what I put there on your outline as we're walking through Numbers 12 in our beginning section, a few things to keep in mind, okay? That when I read this chapter and I start thinking about how people will, change their tune towards us, or you begin to face opposition that you weren't expecting, some of the things that people do are noted here. For example, at times people might change toward us. They never tell us why. They won't. They divert from the issues. Now, eventually this is all going to come out, but God's going to bring it out. But sometimes people will never tell you. If we've done something to cause an issue and God brings it to our heart and mind, then we need to go deal with it. But often you will have somebody that you really thought was a good friend, or it might even have been a family member, and all of a sudden their whole tune towards us changes and we don't even know why. And sometimes even when you ask, you will never get the answer. It's reality. A second thing that I realize when I read this is that people who oppose us can be vocal to others. You know that? Right? They can be vocal to others. Now, you read that, you might think, well, Aaron and Miriam, they're just talking to Moses. I don't think so. Because the punishment for what Miriam does is she has to be put outside the camp for several days because of this sin, which leads to her getting leprosy. Aaron, surprisingly, escapes. Now, that's not because God judges women worse than men, because if you read Numbers 16, there's a guy named Korah, and things don't go well for him and his buddies. But it seems from what you read the passage that Miriam actually was kind of the one spearheading this along with Aaron, but she was more of the spokesman, because in verse 1 it says Miriam and Aaron spoke. The word spoke is a feminine verb, so it points to Miriam being the one that was speaking. Now think about this. More than likely, Moses is the baby brother. And so here is baby brother with all of his relationship with God, and he's now leading the children of Israel. Miriam, we know, is a prophetess. Aaron is the high priest. But Moses, the baby brother, is the one in charge. And for whatever reason, that's not setting well with brother and sister. I got to tell you this too. This Cushite woman, we don't know her name. Moses had been married before to a woman named Zipporah. Now, there's nowhere that indicates that Moses ever had more than one wife. It is my opinion that Zipporah, his first wife, had passed away and he was widowed and he remarried. Surprisingly, this woman was a Cushite. In other words, she was from the area known as Ethiopia. And the Cushites were not a forbidden tribe for Israel to marry into or to marry with. If you read in Exodus 34, there was a list that God gave that when Israel entered the Promised Land, there were certain groups of people they were not to marry. And the Cushites are not listed. The point of it is this again, they're not dealing with the issue. So they're complaining about Moses' wife and on and on and on and on. A third point as we're beginning, then we're going to talk about how do you handle this stuff. When you read this story, eventually the real issue, if you're dealing with somebody who all of a sudden is just kind of turned against you and you weren't expecting it, usually at some time, and it may never come to you personally, but somewhere you find out what the real issue was. Verse 2 tells us the real issue, because Miriam and Aaron said to Moses, "Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses?" They were jealous. They were envious that they didn't have the same relationship with God when it came to leadership. Why? Well, Miriam was a prophetess. But in the previous chapter in Numbers, God had empowered certain men to prophesy, and I wonder if Miriam wasn't starting to feel a little threatened. Aaron's the high priest. I got to be honest with you. I think Aaron needs to grow a spine. When you read through Numbers and Exodus, this guy he just doesn't stand up at times when he needs to. Now, we could maybe all do this. But remember when Moses went to the mountain, he's receiving the commandments, and as he's coming down, there's all this party going crazy in the camp, and when he shows up, what does Aaron say? All these people, you know Moses, they get a little out of hand. He was left in charge. And he said, they wanted a god. He wanted me to form a god. So they brought their gold. I threw it in the fire, and out, poof, out came a golden calf. In Deuteronomy, it says that it was God's intention to take Aaron's life. And Moses prayed for him. Now, that might have been one of those brothers that you would have said, go for it, God. Just go for it. This guy's giving me headaches. He's giving me trouble. But there were times that Aaron needed to speak up, and he didn't. But what I find is that people will sometimes divert from the real issues. They're vocal to others about the problem, but they may not be to you, because I do think Miriam and Aaron said these things in front of other Jews. And also, it's usually at some time the real issue comes out. As we said, for them, Miriam and Aaron were jealous of Moses' position because he's the baby brother, I think, and he shouldn't be given such a monumental task. But there was no one better for the job than that guy. So we all face this. There are some here today, you might be stinging from this having happened to you. In some cases, maybe things got right. In some ways, they maybe didn't. Maybe you tried to make things right when you knew there was an issue and people just rejected and pushed you away. Or you have those people that you counted on who no longer now can you count on. What do? I read through chapter 12, and I got to admit, I'm pretty impressed with how Moses handles this. I think it's really God-honoring. And when we get into this, let's look at this. I want to share with you 4 ways. So what do? Okay? You might see a little similarity to last week, but it's really important to really bring it down to us personally. When stuff like this happens, when you have this opposition, that people are pushing back at you, maybe because you're standing up for truth, whatever the issue might be, is the one thing you got to begin with is you got to handle it with Christ-like humility. Which brings us to verse 3. I want to hear from you. Tell me what you think when you hear this verse. The man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. Somebody tell me, what do you think when you read that verse? What's that? Soft-spoken. Humble. Who wrote this passage? Yeah, we'll get to it. Moses. What's that? It almost seems like too much, doesn't it? I remember when I first read this years ago as a young Christian, and I thought, wait, that just don't fly. But it really does. Because when you think about what Moses is really saying, first of all, let me tell you this, he's just telling us what God led him to write. So obviously, this isn't for him to brag on himself and let everybody know how good he is at handling stuff. I think when you see it, what we actually come to understand is Moses is actually subordinating his own personal interest. He's handing over maybe what he would like to do, like get back at the brother and the sister, and handle things differently, but he's subordinating himself to God's interest and God's cause. He's leaving the situation in God's hands. Meekness is not weakness. In fact, the Greek word, of course this is Hebrew, but the Greek word is a word that means strength under control. It means not responding. It means letting God handle things. Moses isn't saying this stuff to brag on himself. He's actually recognizing how desperately he needs to allow God to handle his brother and his sister instead of trying to do it on his own. The third thing about his meekness is under the first point. When you read through the book of Numbers and Exodus and all, Moses is pretty honest about his failures. He tells you why he didn't get to go into the promised land. I mean, the guy's open about things that are going on in his life. The one thing that I learn when I read this is that often when things happen, you want to respond immediately, don't you? You got to either get back at them, or we feel like we have to give an answer right away. I think James 1 gives us some really good advice. Be what? Swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to react, slow to get angry. And James is a good verse. I think what we learn is we have to sometimes step back. It doesn't mean that you won't be led to respond or to deal with the person or talk to them, but we have to humbly bow before God and say, Lord, this situation, I got to give it to you because I may not handle it right, and I want to handle it in a way that is God honoring. That's all Moses is saying in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, as he's come before God in humility and said, God, I give myself to you. You say, well, why didn't he just say that? I don't know. When you get to heaven, feel free to pull him aside and ask him, why did you say verse 3 like you did? He'll probably look at us and say, does it really matter? But we have to respond in humility. And often that's not the easiest thing to do, especially if someone's dragging your name through the mud. And if you're like me, sometimes you want to respond, right? Defend yourself. Learned a long time ago, that goes nowhere. It goes nowhere. Because even if you're right, people don't always listen. So Moses says, when you face that unexpected opposition from anybody, humble yourself before God. Here's the second thing. Flip over your notes. And I just put it this way, get out of the way. Just get out of the way. What's the first thing you want to do when something goes wrong? You want to fix the problem, right? Men are fixers, right, guys? We're fixers because we always know best. Amen, ladies? No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, that's what we want to do. We want to fix the problem. And so we think, well, I got to respond. I have to react. Now, in this case, God will intervene quickly. But that doesn't always happen, does it? Look at verse number 4, and it says, suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and to Miriam, why don't you three come on out? And then when they all came out, three of them, in verse 6, the Lord said, hear my words. Boy, if that doesn't get your attention. If there is a prophet among you, what does he say? I, the Lord, here's how I make myself known to him in vision and in dreams. This should have awakened Miriam. God was straightening her out and Aaron both. He says, if there's a prophet, this is how I do it. Dreams and visions. But verse 7, 6 major key words. Not so with my servant Moses. If that doesn't get the attention of everybody, nothing will. He says, he is faithful in all my house. With him, I speak mouth to mouth clearly and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. And then this would have really shaken me up. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God decides it's time to clear the air. And then verse 9, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against him, and he departed. What a great note to leave on. God's just a little bit agitated in a righteous, holy way. Moses has said nothing. Moses has stepped back and he's letting God, the best that he can, he's letting God deal with it. The one thing that when I read that, I think because in chapter 11, Moses got agitated, both at God and at the people. And it reminded me as I read chapter 12 that the one thing that you and I have to step back and humble ourselves before God and not want to just immediately feel this pull to say something or to get involved or try to fix it. We have to guard ourselves against bitterness. It's easy to get bitter at people for the things they say and do, isn't it? It is. That's why in verse 31 of Ephesians 4, Paul said, get rid of all bitterness and anger and wrath, all of these things, he says, put them away from you. Because when you don't, it ends up grieving the Spirit of God. And he says in chapter 4, verse 32, and we'll see it in a minute, about forgiveness. God's not going to allow Aaron and Miriam to tear apart what he was doing. But he was going to deal with things in his time and in his way. And sometimes I get impatient. But we can learn patience when we step back and say, okay, Lord, until you tell me I should say something or whether I even should say something, I'm going to pray and I'm going to give this to you. And God, I'm just going to have to let you work. That's hard to do, isn't it? Be honest. We're fixers. People are fixers. We want it that way. Sometimes we can't fix it. But even if we could, and even if we can, and things get fixed, we have to get out of the way and say, God, I got to trust you through this. What can you teach me? It's often when you're going through a tough time like Moses is here, isn't it like, God, why don't you teach them something? They've made my life miserable, or things, they've really hurt us, or they've done some things that have not been right. And so we can become so focused on saying, God, you deal with them. He will, in his time and in his way. We have to let go. Let God do his thing and seek him. Verse 10 tells you what happened. The cloud removed from over the tent. That's God's presence. Then Miriam was leprous like snow. There's a third lesson. And that is this. To me, it's the Old Testament equivalent of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount. Pray for those who oppose you. You could call them your enemies. In fact, Pete Briscoe does a great job explaining who the enemies are that Jesus talks about in Matthew 5. And I agree with them. They're the guys who don't bless you, and they're the guys that aren't kind to you. It's just a word that covers all kinds of things about how people treat us. Notice what happens. In verse number 10, it says, Aaron turned toward Miriam. She was leprous. Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, do not punish us." Because there are two things. Aaron admits it. We've done foolishly, and what else? We've sinned. And then he says, let her not be as one dead whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. And Moses could have just as easily said, yeah, she deserves it. She's been less than gracious towards me. But he prays. In fact, twice in verse 13, Moses' prayer is, Lord, please heal her, please. Now, can you do that? Can I do that? Can we pray for those who don't always treat us well? I mean, only we can answer that, right? In Matthew 5, Jesus said even to bless them, pray for them, do good to them. Luke 6 says that also. I mean, it's like I practice the Matthew 5 prayer. It's not easy. Praying for others, it's really hard to get bitter and angry and hang on to that feeling when you start praying for the other person. And we're not praying, Lord, may their car break down tomorrow. May they lose their job. You know, we're not praying those things, okay? Jesus said you pray for them and you ask God to bless them and you bless them. You wish them well. That's what the word bless means in the New Testament in that context in Matthew 5. Wish them well. Hope they have a great day. Could you do that? Can we do that? We can only do that if we're surrendered and gotten out of the way and said, God, whatever you want to do. Moses humanly, and I wouldn't have blamed him, easily could have said, you know what, I've had it with Miriam and I've had it with Aaron. But he didn't. And they eventually, of course, everything is reconciled, but there's a fourth and final thing, and it's not, the word is not found in the text, but I think you see it in practice, and it's this. You and I have to practice forgiveness. There are people that have done things to us we may never see again. Or even if we do, they may never say to us, I've wronged you, please forgive me. Forgiveness is not predicated on them asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness, according to the Bible, is predicated on a decision that I make to forgive people regardless. Forgiveness means to not seek payment of a debt. That's where the word comes from. It's like if someone owes you money and you wipe that all clean and say they owe you nothing. That means we never go back asking them to give us the cash. We've wiped the debt clean, and that's what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is letting go and not seeking vengeance or not seeking anything in return. It's simply saying, God, help me to forgive. Moses prays for Miriam. To me, it's a sign of forgiveness that he's willing to do that. And he's not going to hang on being just overly ticked off at his brother and his sister. So when you run into those, God may provide you an opportunity to talk to those who maybe at one time were supportive or whatever, whether it's family or not, and they've turned and maybe they've even openly pushed back against us. God may open the door to for us to talk to them. But if he doesn't, and even if he does, and we have been hurt or we feel maybe things were wrong, forgive. Say, that's easier said than done. Yep. But God wouldn't have asked us to or commanded us to if we couldn't do it with his help. I love the fact that Moses prays for Miriam. I just think that says a lot about his character. And it reminds me to do the same thing. Almost in every chapter of Numbers, beginning around chapter 11, Moses learns so many valuable lessons about life. His 40 years of preparation in the desert, taking care of sheep, was God's way of preparing him to lead a couple of million people out of Egypt to the promised land. Imagine that task. When Moses learns, I'm not going to get back at my brother and sister. I'm just going to let God handle it. I'm going to do what I need to do and leave it there. That's what it's about. Let's pray.
You can find more messages like this one at oakridgebc.org and like us on Facebook for encouragement and event updates right to your newsfeed. Thank you for listening to today's message from Oakridge Community Church.